Very warm welcome once again, Mr. Scindia, to kick off our day-long discussions. I don't know how many of you here know that in 1947, when the British finally left India, India had a very large number of airstrips. I'd once reported on that it was nearly 400 airstrips, and the reason for that, Mr. Minister, as you would know, was that the British had believed that the Japanese would invade India, and they had built airstrips pretty much in every district headquarter. From there to now, India is the 21st country or 20th thereabouts when it comes to the number of airports. We know about the traffic. So, Mr. Scindia, I'm going to start today. We are India at 75, but we want to achieve global leadership in the next 25 years. What do you think will be the shape, color, size of India's aviation industry in 25 years? Because every developed economy in the world has a powerful, massive civil aviation infrastructure attached to it.
So first of all, thank you very much for having me. It's always great to be at a Business Today forum. Siddharth has obviously done his research prior to having me on this panel, but I just like to add a caveat to what you just mentioned. We in India had an airline even prior to independence, right? And you had airlines in the Deccan. You had Air India that was operating 5 to 7 years even prior to independence, operated on multiple trunk routes as well as domestic routes. So it would be fair to say that aviation has been part of our DNA for a very, very long time. We had seaplanes in India in the 1910s, 1920s. We had a seaplane landing in a man-made lake in Gwalior way back in 1910, 1920. So civil aviation has been very much part of our DNA for a very, very long time. But the question very aptly asked today is from Amrit Kal to Shatabdi Kal, the journey of India in the area of civil aviation. So let me delve a little bit in the recent past before we talk about our present and before our future. In 2013-14, we had 74 airports in our country. Today, in a span of 8 years, we have built out an additional 67 airports, water ports, and heliports. So we've gone from a number of 74 to 141. We have almost doubled our number of airports, water ports, and heliports in India. If you look at fleet size, in 2013-14, we had roughly about 400 aircraft in India. Today, we're inching close to the 700 number. I believe we're somewhere between 692 to 694. We're going to add capacity at the rate of close to 15% per annum, which means you're soon going to see a fleet in India close to 1,200 to 1,500 planes. Capacity expansion as far as airports are concerned, in the next 5 years, we are looking at a capex plan of close to 97,000 crores purely on airports. That covers the state-owned Airports Authority of India, which has a very aggressive brownfield as well as greenfield program. Close to about 42 airports on the brownfield side are being upgraded, new terminals, capex of almost close to about 30,000 crores odd. We are building out 3 new greenfield projects, Holongi, Dholohera, Hirasar, another 3,500 crores. And equivalently on the private sector side, brownfield, again, expanding 7 current airports, close to about 34,000 crores, and building out an additional 4 new greenfield projects, close to about 31,000 crores. So that is the thrust. Now, why is that happening is going to be Siddharth's next question. And the reason why that's happening is really simple. You have a country of 1.3 billion people. But pre-pandemic, we had only 144 million flyers in India. If you look at the railways, which is, I believe, our closest competitor, only in the region, and I'm taking a segment of the railways. I'm not taking the whole transportation system of the railways, because I'm looking at an apples to apples comparison. If you look at only the air-conditioned part of railways, so only first AC and only second AC. So first AC and second AC, pre-pandemic, we had close to about 185 million travelers. So the delta between civil aviation and railways is roughly about 40 million travelers per year. However, the important point here is if you look at the CAGR, the compounded annual growth rate, the CAGR for railways is close to about 5.6%, whereas the CAGR for civil aviation is close to 10.3%. So therefore, it's my prediction that in the years to come, it may take us another 5 years, 7 years, but in the years to come, you're actually going to look at the number of travelers in civil aviation becoming pretty much the bulwark of air-conditioned travel in India as a means of transportation. Pre-pandemic, we had, as I mentioned, 144 million domestic travelers and 60 million international travelers. What's my forecast? My forecast is in the next 5 to 7 years, that number of 200 million is going to grow to 400 million travelers. That's the kind of delta in growth that you're going to see in the civil aviation business.
Mr. Scindia, you gave us several interesting data points. I don't know how many in this room know that after the United States, which has a massive number of airports, Brazil comes second with 4,000 plus, and then Mexico. I never knew that, sir. 2-3 questions in follow-up to what you said. How easy or difficult is it for you to build airports? I was recently at the first commercial flight that landed at Devghar, and I could see that, I mean, the whole town was out to basically welcome that flight. You had also welcomed that. How easy or difficult is it to build airports? Because without that, there cannot be the growth that you spoke about.
So the point here, Siddharth, is to look at civil aviation. Today, when we look at the civil aviation space, what do we end up talking about mostly? We talk about international connectivity to India, so I to D. And then we talk about domestic connectivity between metros, one metro to the other. But that's only a segment of the story. The bigger segment of the story is actually connectivity, as you mentioned, to tier 2 and tier 3 cities. Because that's where the growth is going to come from. So let me give you another data point. In the last 7 years, metro connectivity has grown between 7 to 8%, between 2010 to 2015 period, and then 2015 to 2020. So I'm taking a 5-year sliver for metro connectivity. Non-metro connectivity, i.e. tier 2, tier 3, grew by 11% in 2010 to 15, and an earth-staggering 31.3% between 2015 to 2020. So what does that tell us in civil aviation? That tells us in civil aviation that the new growth areas are going to be from regional spaces. That tells us in civil aviation that while you concentrate on international connectivity and the 6 metros, also concentrate on last mile connectivity. And what I mean by last mile connectivity, and I'm going to take you back to the first comment that you made while we started this interaction, is that yes, look at I to D, look at metro to metro, but also look at metro to 2 tier and 3 tier, and finally look at 2 tier to 3 tier to last mile connectivity. And therefore the thrust has to also be on regional connectivity, which is why in the last year, you've seen that under UDAN, we have brought in a new scheme, which is the small aircraft scheme. India has to also look at the last mile connectivity in terms of sub-20-seater aircraft. So this round of bidding, which is UDAN 5.0 that we've taken out, we've actually concentrated within fixed wing also at sub-20-seater aircraft that will provide that last mile connectivity. Last October, I came out with a new helicopter policy, Because in hilly states like Uttarakhand, Himachal, Jammu Kashmir, our northeastern states, that helicopter is the only way that you can provide that last mile connectivity. And the penetration levels of helicopters in India are today abysmal. We have a fleet of roughly 250 helicopters in India. When you talk about the US, you're talking about 3,500 helicopters. You talk about Brazil, you're talking about 4,000 helicopters. And therefore, the new heli policy that we came out with, where we scrapped all TNFC charges, RNLC charges, so as to make it much more capitally efficient as an industry. We brought in a Heli Seva portal that you no longer have to go through the torturous route of getting Army and ATC permissions. You'd put it onto a portal. So we're slowly graduating towards that. We're trying to move to a scenario where we will have multiple helipads in multiple states and therefore provide that last mile connectivity. The final point I'd like to make is that if you look at the last 6 months where there has been revenge travel across the world, and you look at the tsunami sort of situation in international airports, I must commend our domestic airports at doing an amazing job and actually standing out as a beacon to the international peers in terms of how to service customers.
Mr. Scindia, there are two and more world-class airports. I'm talking about Mumbai and Delhi. Who will build most of the new airports over the next decade? Will it be the Airports Authority of India, or will it be private corporations like Adani?
It has to be both. I think that it's important that we understand in India that government has A, finite resources, and B, I think it's also important to look at the stress on government where the social benefits of investment are greater, i.e. health, i.e. education, i.e. other sectors where we create a safety net. Pradhan Mantri Fasal Bima Yojana, Kisan Yojana, those areas. So whilst, as I mentioned to you, you have a close to a 34,000 crore capex plan of Airports Authority of India alone in the next 3 to 5 years. The private sector is also redoubling its effort with close to about a 65,000 crore capex plan. But let me tell you this, that when you talk about the metros, metro airports in India, it's not confined to Delhi and Bombay. Let's look at Delhi today, which, yes, certainly is a leader. 70 million throughput capacity today in the Delhi airport, growing to 100 million by this December. You're going to have another new airport coming up in Jewar, 12 million in phase 1, 70 million in phase 2. Bombay today is capped out already at close to about 55, 60 million. You're going to have a new airport coming up in Navi Mumbai, which ultimately will be close to 50 million capacity. Chennai airport is going to grow from close to 35 million to 55 million in the next 2 years. Both Bangalore and Hyderabad are going to grow from currently 25 million to close to 50 million. And Calcutta airport, again, is going to grow from current 30 million to almost 54 million in capacity. Now, many of these airports are being still manned by Airports Authority of India. But if you look at the 6 metros alone, the current capacity of 221 million passenger throughput at the 6 metros is going to grow to close to 456 million in the next 4 years. That's the kind of leap that we're looking at in the days to come in civil aviation as far as metros are concerned.
Do you see any of these airports going into private hands in the metros?
Most of them are already in private hands.
Calcutta, for example?
Well, at this point of time, I think that we've got a very aggressive capex plan in place, both in Calcutta and in Chennai. At this point of time, I think Airports Authority of India is doing a yeoman's job in terms of putting that in place.
How is the Air India disinvestment panning out? I don't mean to say that otherwise, but most civil aviation ministers would say that their portfolio isn't the same without Air India, but you clearly aren't one of those. How is the Air India disinvestment panning out into the public here and those who are watching us? What are the benefits that you see that have already accrued and going down the line, sir?
So first, I think it's an important point that you brought about, Siddharth. I think it's important to understand that what is or what should be a minister's role as far as his or her PSUs are concerned or CPSEs are concerned. I think government's role should be that of a visionary, should be one of who he or she sets the roadmap. But I think the nuts and bolts, the delivery, the execution must be left to the management of that PSU. I think ministers, bureaucrats, on a day-to-day basis, handling PSUs is not a healthy sign. And whether, not in my current stint alone as a minister, but from my initial stint when I was telecom and IT minister, or commerce and industry minister, or power minister, across the board, I have always maintained, the first statement I have made in my dashboard meetings, which I have held in each one of these ministries, which is a regular feature every Monday, along with all the ministry folk, has always been that the ministry sets the vision for a PSU. But I do not want, and I'm very clear in that, I do not want any interference from the minister himself or the ministry in the day-to-day running of any PSU. That's not our job. That's the job of a CMD. Because if you intend to do that, then you might as well not have a CMD of a PSU. You might as well become the CMD of the PSU. You have to set targets, and on a quarterly basis, or like you would do within your company, on an H1 basis or a fiscal basis, look how we are measuring against those targets. So for example, I certainly look at the CapEx deployment of our PSUs across the board on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis. Are we actually executing according to the deadlines that we've set? But that's where I draw the line. The management is there to do their job. And similarly was the case with Air India. My hands are quite full with or without Air India. I did not, whilst I was Minister of Civil Aviation, interfere in the day-to-day workings of Air India. And I believe that now it's gone into private hands. I'm very confident that under the new management, it will soar to new heights, no pun intended. And I'm very confident with their fleet expansion plans in place and with their reservoir of expertise, both on the IT front as well as the hospitality front. I think a lot of that should come to bear on the Air India value proposition for customers in the days to come.
Mr. Minister, I have observed and reported on all those beats and portfolios that you have held, and I completely agree with you. My question, do you see the Civil Aviation Ministry existing in 2047?
Oh, absolutely.
And why would that be? Why would we need a government setup?
I think you do, because let me give you one example, right? When you have sunrise sectors in a country, and I've seen that with my experience with this particular example that I'm going to talk to you about, the Prime Minister was very clear in his vision that India has to become the world's drone hub in the years to come. So what does that entail? When you're setting up, when you're proliferating, when you're giving new impetus to a hitherto unknown industry in our country, I believe that any successful model rests on three tripods, three legs of a tripod. The first leg is you must have a conducive policy. And so, for example, when we came out with the new drone policy, I believe in March last year, when I took over in June, July, we completely redid the whole policy, did away with all the permissions, all the fees, brought about a really industry, consumer-friendly policy within a span of close to about 2 months. In August, we revealed the new drone policy. So the first leg is policy making. We brought about an airspace map, which I think is not talked about enough. But we always look towards the West in terms of the models, in terms of what they've done, whether it's the US or Europe or Canada or other countries. In India, we brought about an airspace map which very clearly delineated red areas, yellow areas, and green areas within a span of 30 days of announcing the new drone policy. I had committed to a 30-day deadline, and mind you, this is not an easy task. Why? Because you have to sit with all 36 state governments and union territories. You have to sit with all your line ministries in the center and understand from them what is strategic, what is non-strategic, what is a fly zone, what is a no-fly zone. And we were able to do that within a period of 30 days for industry. So the first leg of the tripod is policy making. The second leg of the tripod is incentives. And so, again, within 2 months, we came out with a PLI scheme for drones. An industry that had as total revenue only about 65 crores. We came out with an incentive policy over a 3-year period of 120 crores for a nascent industry. And today I'm glad to report to you that 23 companies have been given recognition under the PLI policy, and the turnover of those 23 companies has grown from a base of 88 crores in August last year, based on the PLI scheme, to 319 crores in a period of 12 months. That's the kind of growth impetus that has come about. The third leg of the tripod is creation of demand. And for an industry that is nascent, is just about being born in India, the creation of demand for drones as a service across 12 line ministries of Government of India. The Agricultural Department pushing the use of pesticides, the Rural Development Department pushing the use of drones for Swamitva, which is the cadastral survey being done completely by drones. The Mines Ministry looking at using drones for exploration of mines. The Power Ministry looking at inspection of transmission towers with drones as opposed to humans. That demand creation has also been done by government. And therefore, I firmly believe that government's role is seminary in terms of new industries and technologies that are coming about. The next technology paradigm that's going to happen, not today, not tomorrow, but maybe in 2 years, 3 years, once EASA and FAA give approval, is eVTOLs, electronic vertical takeoff and landing vehicles. That industry also must make its core base in India. And that's one of the things that I'm exploring as we talk today. So certainly government has a role, an extremely important role in terms of spawning new technologies and new areas in India.
In the last few minutes that we have...
And therefore, just if I may summarize, the government's role has to move from that hat of being a regulator to becoming that of becoming a facilitator. We are one with you. We are equal stakeholders with you. And therefore, even within my ministry, I never sit at the head of the table. I sit at the center of the table. Because then we are equal stakeholders along with everyone else, learning from each other and looking at what is the best path forward through discussion, debate, and getting that conclusion on the basis of which we move ahead.
How happy are you with our aviation regulator, or do you feel the need to further empower it, maybe not make it the US FAA, but somewhere close by?
Well, our aviation regulator, in any case, both, we have two regulators. One is for safety, which is DGCA, and the other is for security, which is BCAS, Bureau of Civil Aviation Security. They both are completely independent. They function totally autonomously. My job is to make sure that there is accountability to both the safety side and the security side. And my job also, as I mentioned to you, is to make sure I facilitate them. Now, with the huge expansion that we are seeing in civil aviation, the numbers that I put out to you makes it even more pertinent that we augment the staffing, the capabilities of both DGCA and BCAS. And that's something that I'm working on as we speak.
Would you, one quick interjection, would you favor a government officer or a former government officer for that position, or someone who is genuinely an expert of the industry?
I don't think you need to get into this dichotomy of government versus non-government. What you need is the best quality person at that job.
Okay.
And I think that's the frame that we need to look at within India. And which is why you're seeing so many lateral movements under Prime Minister's prerogative from the private sector now working in government. I have many officers within my ministry that have come in from a consulting background that are spending 2 years within civil aviation, adding tremendous amount of value, which is why you're seeing people from within government under Mission Karma Yogi, again of Prime Minister's prerogative, where government officers today are going and spending 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks at the private sector, learning from private sector companies and inculcating best practices. I think that cross-pollination must happen. That cross-fertilization must happen. And then there's a lot that both sides can learn from each other.
My final question, the Maruti moment for India's aviation industry, at least in terms of passengers, was the arrival of Air Deccan. If you look at tariffs and if we adjust them for inflation, we could completely agree with the point of the airlines that they have kept tariffs pretty reasonable. But there are two issues in terms of sustainability that this industry faces, sir, and you are quite aware of that. One is the sustainability of the airlines themselves, the fastest way for a billionaire to become a millionaire, and some in India have already done that. Do you think our industry is sustainable given that the government, one hand of the government, imposes such high ATF taxation burdens? And second, in terms of airfares, after this period of mandated airfares, where do you see the future headed?
So as far as the taxation structure, or let me take a step back and say the cost composition structure of civil aviation is concerned. The fact is that ATF is close to about 40% of the cost structure of an airline. And the fact that ATF has gone from 53,000 rupees a kiloliter to close to about 141,000 rupees a kiloliter in the last 1.5 to 2 years has put a tremendous amount of pressure on airlines, no doubt about that. Fortunately, though, in the last 2 weeks, ATF has declined by close to about 12.5%, down to 116,000 rupees a kiloliter, and I see that trend hopefully continuing. But the Civil Aviation Ministry has not been sitting back and laying still. One of the first things I did when I took charge, when I understood the cost structure of our sector, is we looked at how we're going to allay this cost structure. There are two ways that we could do it. The first was to ensure that ATF comes under GST. But that, as we all know, is not a step that you can just take with a government order, because it has to go to GST Council, there has to be a lot of debate, there has to be a lot of discussion. Based on that acceptance, only does something become a part of GST. So what did I do? As opposed to saying, there's not much we can do, I then started approaching the states. And when I came in, Siddharth, we had 12 states that charged VAT on ATF between 1 to 4%. But we had 26 states in India, states and union territories, that charged VAT on ATF between 20 to 30%. Huge amount of VAT on air turbine fuel. And so therefore, I coordinated, spoke, requested, pleaded with every single chief minister of 22 states to start with. Tried to make them understand the Laffer curve argument of if you lower taxes, you're actually going to increase revenue. If you lower ATF, you're going to see greater amount of connectivity happening across India, especially in your state, because most airlines will be incented to connect into your state. And I'm glad to report to you today that this last 9 to 10 months of very, very hard work has yielded 16 states in India lowering their ATF, VAT on ATF from 20 to 30% down to 1 to 4%. That's a huge move. So as opposed to a breakup of 12 and 26, today we have 28 states that are between 1 to 4% and only 8 states that still charge between 20 to 30%. My pursuit with those 8 states will continue, and through your medium, I'd like to request those 8 states also to come on board as soon as possible and therefore proliferate travel in their states as well.
We'll leave the names of those 8 states for later, but Mr. Scindia, thank you very much on behalf of Business Today and the India Today Group. On behalf of 1 billion Indians, you are the man in command, the pilot in charge for their aviation dreams. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
If you like the video, do like, comment, share and subscribe.